The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com.
Hello and welcome back to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. I'm your host, Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arce, and this month, hello July, we are saluting you with America 250 and our look at Freemasonry's unique role in the shaping of America's history. We'll continue with probably one of our most drink-along episodes to date, but first you can follow along and learn along with Craftsman Online this summer on our website at craftsmanonline.com. That's where you'll find the details on the cool summer school program with Arizona State University we've teamed up to promote. What the founders meant by happiness. This is such a cool course that was outlined by the National Constitution Coalition, and the learning that goes into all of these modules. First of all, they're completely fascinating. If you've done online learning as an adult, you know how boring some of those can be. This is so engaging and fun. It's almost like a game with really cool videos and content that's involved. It's appropriate for everybody in the family. So yes, even your kids can join you and do some learning about American history, our founding fathers, and really what the role of an American citizen really should be in society. Get started and join us at craftsmanonline.com. Just click on the summer school link. For this episode, we are traveling to the oldest lodge in the Grand Lodge of Connecticut, Hiram Lodge No. 1. That's where we catch up with their past master, Cedric Jacobson. I was looking forward to this one just for the title. I know that we're going to get clicks just on drunk American history, how Punch held a new nation together. But I was blown away reading, would you call it, a research paper, a Punch Bowl report?
Yeah, I think like most of the conversations we've had, I saw some things and wondered and started to pull at the thread. And it did culminate in a research paper that was presented at the Masonic Lodge of Research in Connecticut.
Okay. And then I'm just curious because, we're Masons. Was there a little bit of show and drink tell that was also involved?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you observed the scientific process throughout this entire...
I can't help that training. We really got into trying to dial it in.
Nice. Well, as fun as this conversation is going to be about the drink that really, it dates America because it really points, and it is a colonial and it is a revolutionary thing. And if you want to know what people were doing in 1776, they were drinking all day because that's really how they were having a good time. But we're going to get into some of the history that evolves around a society and drinking and getting together. And that's why we brought back one of our research lodge favorites, Worshipful Brother Cedric Jacobson. Welcome back to the Craftsman Online Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to take brothers and our listeners back to when American Masons were meeting in these places called taverns or public houses. Today we call them bars, but back then that's how they were known. And it wasn't like Cheers where everybody knew your name, but it kind of was. Like, what was life like in early American or colonial communities, and what was the role of these taverns?
Yeah, it was really kind of a one-stop shop. There's this kind of recent phenomenon in sociology, pop psychology, thinking about a third space, which I think for many of us, Lodge is our third space. We have our home life, our work life, and then another space where we have camaraderie and friendship. And in early colonial America, there was your work, whatever that was, your home life. And then I would add church was a big part of early American society. And we see that from the earliest settlements, right? There were churches, but universally there were taverns and inns, oftentimes in the same building. It would be a place where you would go. If you wanted prepared food, that was the place. If you wanted to have a work meeting, that was the place. If you wanted to send something in the mail, that was the place. So it really was kind of the everywhere place of early colonial America.
I'm trying, because the way you were describing it, it sounds like the hotel, the inn, the restaurant, the bar, the mail place, because none of this really existed in towns. You may have had like a blacksmith and like a butcher or some other trades folks, and then there was the tavern. And as you're saying, like, there wasn't television back then. There were books. I mean, it wasn't like people didn't have outlets for creativity or free time. But the role of the tavern, you didn't go there to get drunk. I mean, of course, that's what ended up happening. But it was like a socially acceptable place to be, where now when you hear about people who hang out in bars in 2026, you're like, are they a member of something else as well?
Yeah. Certainly it feels like now there's a lot of baggage associated with spending lots of time at drinking establishments. But because it was where you went to do everything, it was a post office. It would be the same as I'm just nipping out to the post office or stopping to grab lunch. It was just a fact of daily life. And between the early churches, the meeting houses, which is what they're typically called in like early settlement New England, and the taverns and inns, that was like the places to be if you weren't at home doing your work.
Fun fact, I think it could revive the U.S. Postal Service if they did start serving beer during
business. Those lines a lot more comfortable, I think.
Oh, yeah, and cheerier. How would you describe the typical day of a tavern back in the 18th century? I mean, did they start when the cock crowed in the morning and go all the way until past midnight?
Yeah, I think the most common taverns also had a few rooms for rent. So they were kind of like early inns. And obviously, if you were traveling by horse at the time, you didn't really have meals with you. So it would typically, there would be breakfast available, some lunch fare available, and dinner obviously as well. And with all those meals, often beer, right? The taverns tended to brew their own beer. It wasn't beer for the sake of drinking beer. If we look at kind of the history of alcohol, it was a calorie-dense food. It was another way to get your calories.
That's actually why I'm drinking today. Well, you also stated in your presentation, because this is all building up to a punch bowl and a super secret lost drink recipe for all time that just really showed how much people love celebrating back in the day. One of the stats you shared in your presentation was, quote, Americans between 1790 and 1830 drank more alcoholic beverages per capita than ever before or since.
Yeah.
So how was drinking viewed during this early time in American history?
Yeah, I think obviously there were still the people that society looked down on, the people who habitually overconsumed. But I think just like the tavern, it was a large part of life. It's with the challenges surrounding potable water nationwide, not being able to trust that water from a cistern or water from a river or creek or spring. Well, springs were usually your safest bet, but the other sources were not contaminated in some fashion. The sort of process of brewing beer or then distilling liquid into spirits essentially purified it and made it safe to drink no matter what. Even your low ABV beers were considered pretty safe to drink.
Interesting that beer was not only a calorie health choice, but also a cleaner, safer option than water at that time, which is always funny because whenever you watch a movie from that period, like for me, it was The Patriot with Mel Gibson, and they take that big wooden ladle and, sip water from like a bowl or something. And I'm like, there's no way that's triple filtered. There's no way that that's even cool. Like room temperature, it's probably ugh. And then when they actually try to show it historically accurate, like water back then was pretty much brown and you had to chew it. It was nasty.
Yeah. I mean, if I had the choice between a bucket of that or a beer, the choice is pretty clear to me.
Pretty simple, especially if you can get it at 7 a.m. And that it's basically widely acceptable. I mean, would you say society back then was just like, a drink in someone's hand didn't make you a drunkard at the bar until things got out of control?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable description. That time period, from the stat you mentioned, from 1790 to 1830s, right? That's sort of a little after the early founding of the country, right? When we look at the sort of Puritans that settled here were tended to be more teetotal, but then the sort of like second and third wave of immigrants that came here to establish a new life, rapid expansion. And like I mentioned, lack of safe drinking water just meant that was the answer to have something that was safe to drink.
We've set aside the month of July to highlight and celebrate America 250. Brother Cedric is joining us on this episode of the Craftsman Online podcast. One of the things that, I find so amazing about the role of the tavern and having the drinks is because this was a central spot, like let's just fairly say, they call it the public house. It's where everybody got together for meals or just to socially be active. This was also the place where the conversations were happening and Masons were meeting in places like this. So if you were to walk into one of these places, like, is it getting pretty busy and is there a lot of conversation happening like after the sun goes down, a little bit beforehand? Like when does this really become kind of the reality show of that time?
Yeah, I imagine probably sometime after sundown. I think because, business was conducted there. Also, as you mentioned, it is kind of like the spot for the town crier, as it were. Like if you wanted to hear what was going on, that was the place. The owner of the tavern or the folks working there would see people come and go all day long. So they knew kind of the pulse of the town. I do think, when we look at early Masonic history, especially here in the States, although overseas as well, but especially here in the States, most private residences didn't have a big enough room to host a lodge. And there weren't at that time like dedicated lodge buildings. And so the easiest way to do that was to rent a private room in an inn or tavern. And so if we look at sort of the historic jobs of the tiler, right? Like now we think of the tiler's job as to guard the door, right? But traditionally, if you look at what they were charged with, and this is still the case in a lot of installation ceremonies, they're charged with like keeping secure the furniture of the lodge and transporting it to and from the lodge. And that's why if you look in early Masonic records, the tiler was often a paid position, as it were. There was some recompense for the trouble that they went through to schlep stuff to and from the tavern. And in addition, we nowadays in lodge ritual, we use tracing boards. They're called that because early on, the sort of symbols that are referenced in those degrees were literally like written on the floor in the written room in chalk. And it was sort of like encircled by a rope so no one would step on it. And then at the end of the meeting, the tiler would be in charge of mopping off the floor so that those things were removed.
I love these stories because in my mind, I sit here and go back to our ritual where we talk about chalk and charcoal. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's, in a Masonic lesson, but there's also some history to that because as you're pointing out, like that used to be how our lodge was situated. Everything was drawn on the ground. And I'm just trying to imagine like, a group of people sitting down, for dinner at the public house. And all of a sudden these men come in and one of them's carrying a Holy Bible, which would have been like walking around with a giant 95-inch plasma 4K, the latest TV under your arm, going into this room where you hear knocks and knocks and there's a guy outside standing there or sitting in, with a sword across his lap and, you have to know a password to get here. And then they come out afterwards and they hang out and they're drinking beers and they're talking about all of this. Like, how do you feel the perception of Masonry was in that time when, yes, it was private and yes, it was secret, but it was also a little bit more out in the open? Yeah,
I think because lodges met in more public spaces, there was not, I think it goes back to that sort of cliche description, right? That we're not a secret society, we're a society with secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in those early days, those were often men who were pillars of their community, right? And that notion of guarding well the West Gate was taken very seriously. And you would not want someone in lodge who would not make the craft more broadly be like a respected organization.
So we know Brother Cedric as the past master of the Masonic Lodge of Research number 401 in New Haven, Connecticut. But your mother lodge is Hiram Lodge No. 1, which for those of you playing at home, there is a significant historical difference in, nothing aside, but between Lodge No. 1 and Lodge No. 400. one. So what is the history of Hiram Lodge No. 1 in New Haven? When were you guys founded and what was going on in the country during that?
Sure. So Hiram was founded in 1750. We still have the original charter. So I think it's the oldest extant charter in the Western Hemisphere. It was granted via the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, but directly connected back to the Grand Lodge of England. So the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts at the time was really kind of a subdivision of the United Grand Lodge of England. So it was chartered in 1750, predates the Grand Lodge of Connecticut by decades. So it has that old ritual.
It predates our country by like 26 years, which I know people are like, oh, 26 years. I'm like, that's legitimately a generation. Like you could have had a whole generation of Masons before we even had a country. Like that's crazy.
Yeah, it is pretty wild. And we, that dates back to a time early on when Masonry had been codified, right? If you look at the early histories, there wasn't even a master's degree for the first, I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's like at least 8 years, I think, from the founding of UGLE. So our earliest record books, our earliest minute books, there's two separate ones that run in parallel. One for the Entered Apprentice and Fellowcraft Lodge, and then one for the Master's Lodge.
Wow.
And it wasn't until I think the 1790s or early 1800s that they merged into like 1 minute book where they met consistently together.
Who were some of the famous brothers from your lodge? Even if they're just kind of known in New Haven, but I'm going to guess that these would be some of the early patriots.
Probably someone famous was Amos Doolittle. He was like a big deal in New England and in Connecticut. His house, or at his home, he hosted lodge starting in like 1800 for a decade. David Worcester, who was a colonial like war hero and like a big deal in New England history, is a member. I'm trying to think of more recent people. We had lots of visitors over the years. New Haven was originally like kind of a fort town. It was the first planned like gridded city in the country. And so because the members of the military would come through, we had a lot of visitors. Probably the most famous / infamous, Benedict Arnold sat in our lodge a few times.
Way to bury the lead, Cedric.
Yeah.
Some guy you may have heard of. I mean, just the biggest known traitor of all time. The only Freemason to ever have his name scratched from the rolls of his lodge. Yeah, some guy named Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I still have the lodge still has in its possession the minutes from the meeting that he sat in there.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of people over the years. To circle back to the original question about kind of the history of the lodge, the first research paper that I ever did was just trying to locate all of the places that our lodge had met and kind of mapping it back onto an early plan of the city. And essentially it was, I'm looking for my key here. It was like house, tavern, house, tavern, house for like the first, until 1801 or 1802 when Amos Doolittle had a big enough room in his house to host us. So for smaller meetings, especially the Master's Lodge, it would kind of bounce around between brothers' houses. And then most of the other meetings were at local taverns.
How many brothers would you guesstimate, or do you know that were in attendance for these meetings?
That's a great question. Look to see if I have a note of that. So this was obviously like pre-Masonic explosion where we saw a ton of people. Often in those early meetings, there would be, minimum, I would say like 10 people, often around 20.
Okay.
So not a giant lodge, but at the time, the lodges were a lot smaller, and it was much more expected that you were there every meeting.
How does that compare to your attendance in modern times now?
Well, I think any of us could consider our own mother lodges, right?
I was going to say 10 guys would be pretty good. 20 would be just a solid turnout. It would be like, wow, we're packed. We have 20 people here tonight.
Right.
Yeah.
In a room that was built 100 years ago to hold 100 people, 150 people.
Yeah. It's interesting how some things have changed and then there's some things that are still the constant. For people that haven't been to Connecticut, or just folks that if you put a map in front of them and said, for $100, can you put your finger where Connecticut is? I think most of us have heard of Hartford, Connecticut, but specifically New Haven. What are you close to, and what was going on in New Haven during that colonial time? Were you guys building ships? Were you an agriculture community? What was going on there?
Yeah. So most of the like shipping and things went a little bit upriver, a little bit deeper into Connecticut. New Haven was on Route 1, aka the Boston Post Road, aka at this time, the Kings Road between New York and Boston. So it is on the coastline of the Sound between Long Island and Connecticut. And so it's right there on the coast. It is like an hour and a half northeast of New York City.
Okay.
Maybe 2.5, 3 hours from Boston by car.
So by horse, back in those days, your tavern would have been the spot where people most likely would have stopped overnight. Thus, that news from what was going on in Boston and New York City, New Haven would have kind of been a hub.
It definitely was, yeah.
Okay. So we've got Masons, we've got activity that's going on in New Haven, we've got Hiram Lodge, and now we're going to fast forward the timeline a little bit to this artifact that you discovered. What do you call the famous punch bowl, and what's the story behind it?
So it was how this got started was as I was compiling the research for that presentation on the homes of old Hiram, where we traced the 30 plus places that our lodge met over those 250 years, almost 300 years. Digging back through the old archives, there were receipts. And it would be a receipt that was like 2 gallons of sherry, a gallon of rum, and and then it would just be booze. And then like a thing of sugar and limes or lemons. And the first time you see that, you're like, that's pretty interesting. But the 30th time you see one of those, it's like, there's a pattern here. And I was mentioning it to some of the older brothers in lodge, people who had been there a bit longer. I think when I was doing this research, I'd been a Mason for like 6 or 7 years. And so I was just talking to some of the older brothers, and one of them mentioned, at some point we had a punch bowl that dates to that time period, to the early colonial days of the country. And I asked, and nobody seemed to know where it was. And kept asking, and eventually got a hold of someone who said, "Oh yeah, that's we have it under the care of the like local historical society," which felt like a jackpot. So, I had heard stories of this punch bowl. If you just go on Google and search for Masonic punch bowl, you will see pictures of ones that look like ours. I didn't know that at times, right? So I didn't know what it looked like at all. I just knew that it theoretically existed. And so I set up an appointment to go to the Historical Society. So just called the New Haven Museum and Historical Society. It was, like 2 or 3 blocks from the lodge. Another old like colonial building down there, like made an appointment with the head curator there who pulled it out of storage, and we were able to look at it and photograph it and like bring back that information to share with the lodge. It in the 1970s, I think there was a robbery at that museum, and someone stole a pair of Revolutionary War pistols, pistols, and knocked over the punch bowl, and so it was broken. And the lodge and the Historical Society paid to have it like professionally repaired. And if you look really closely, you can see the hairline fractures. And they were able to supply us with like the report of those repairs and everything. So we found the punch bowl. We were really excited, and that sort of like drew connections back to those. All those receipts that we saw the lodge pay out. So
for our listener that's sitting here going, okay, the last time somebody got excited about punch and the punch bowl was like back in high school at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance when I was, spiking the punch or something. But let's just talk about this, because we kind of already established that drinking was basically socially acceptable during this time. It was a proven fact that drinks was cleaner and in most instances a healthier choice than water. So you'd show up somewhere and people I'm assuming this would be a show of class and kind of stature to have these nice, were they China from England or where do these come from?
They were made in China, in fact. Special ordered and shipped overseas. So the punch bowl that was given to Hiram, the military officer that made that custom order, it is said in his family lore that he ordered a pair, intending the other for George Washington.
Wow.
But by the time it had gotten back to us stateside, George Washington had unfortunately passed, but the brothers still gifted it to the family. No one knows where that is, but that's sort of the family lore around the punch bowl.
And then somehow it ends up in the hands of the brothers of Hiram Lodge. And then somehow in the 1970s, when somebody steals a pistol out of a museum, they knock it over and it gets restored. And then it ends up in your hands and you're like, okay, let's make some punch. This is going to be everyone's favorite part of the episode here. We're going to get to the drunk history part. The recipe of the punch. I'm going to guess that this was a trial and error. You had your vessel and it was your charge to fill it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to kind of summarize what we saw in the receipts, I'm just looking at some pictures that I took of them back in the day. So I saw sherry, I saw gin, lemons, crackers, because you need something to in your stomach during
how
time.
Strong was this stuff?
It's pretty strong.
You could take dental surgery afterwards and not feel a thing.
Yeah, it'll sneak up on you.
Okay. And what did it taste like? I'm thinking punch like fruit punch, like.
Yeah, it didn't actually taste super fruity. I wish that I could describe the general flavor. It does not taste really boozy because it typically had lemon or lime and some sugar. So it's deceptive because it does actually contain a lot of alcohol. It's kind of like, if you think back to, college days or house party days and like jungle juice for our generation, every house kind of had their own recipe. Mm-hmm. There was a general guideline that was followed at the time, and it was all about ratios. So the ratio was 1 of sour, 1 of sweet, 4 of strong, and 6 of weak. So the sour would be your, that's 1 part lemon or lime typically, and then match that part with sweetness, typically like turbinado sugar, unrefined sugar.
So like a cup of lemon juice and a cup of sugar, pretty much. We're going to go in equal parts. Okay.
4 of strong, so that would be whatever the spirit is. It could be gin, it could be whiskey, it could be rum, it could be any of the above. And 6 of weak. So typically that was something to water it down a little bit.
So I'm trying to think like what would be widely available, like cider, apple cider?
It could be cider. It could be something like sherry that's a little lower alcohol content. Yeah. It could be, it's called a shrub nowadays, and it's sort of started to come back into fashion. A shrub is basically, everything but the alcohol. So when you would make the punch, you would first extract the lemon stuff, the lemon or lime, right? So you obviously wanted the juice, but another important part was the zest, and you would zest it or finely grate off or peel off, and then take basically a mortar and pestle, right, where you kind of grind it together with that rough turbinado sugar. And that sugar, those rough sugar crystals kind of break apart the membranes in the zest and extract a lot of the flavor and the essential oil. So you grind it and you let it sit for like a half hour to an hour. That creates something called an oleosaccharum, which is basically just a sweet, oily substance. So that would go in with whatever your weak ingredient was. Sometimes it's just water, like warm water, or it might be tea. You might brew tea and cool it down, green tea or black tea. And so the oleosaccharum and the sugar and the lime or lemon juice were mixed with whatever the week was, whether that was the water or tea or what have you. And that made the shrub. So the shrub was everything but the booze.
What would have been, I'm sure other professional drinking listeners are all asking the same question that what would have been the most widely popular or, booze of choice 200 years ago?
Yeah. And, I looked for patterns in the receipts. It seems like it might have been what was in vogue or what was available at the time. The most common ones that appeared in our receipts were brandy was first, rum was second, sherry was third. And then in a kind of a wild twist, sometimes they would just use a really full, like deep red wine, and sometimes gin. The gin punch is something that we didn't really explore because it wasn't super common in our punch days.
Yeah, so gross. Because I'm guessing they used the gin with juniper, and it was just probably like
I imagine it was
strong,
pretty strong.
Yeah,
but it's on my list of things to explore.
The rum makes sense, and this is what makes this 200-year-old recipe kind of fun. Is that we joked about it. You went through the scientific process. And if you want to read the research paper, you took all of this, you took the receipts, you laid them over each other. And, through some sort of mad scientist equation, you're like, oh, well, we actually have kind of like quadrants of ingredients that would have fit. So let's go through all of this. Do you know how many batches you created as your test / sample?
Let's see, we made 4 different shrubs. So one that was a lemon base, one that was lime, one that was lemon and green tea, and one that was lemon and black tea. We didn't do a lime tea version because in none of the receipts did we ever see lime and tea in the same receipt. And so we made 4 different shrubs, and then we tried 7 different spirit combinations. So this was, again, based on the receipts. It was either straight rum or rum and sherry, rum and red wine, rum and brandy and sherry, or brandy and red wine. So that makes 28 different combinations that we tried.
Okay. So you didn't do the gin, thank God. Okay, great.
Yes.
And I'm imagining, because this is a very scientific and, a closed experiment. So you're pouring like little thimbles and everyone's just kind of taking a test. And is it like a wine tasting where you're ranking it based on, texture and tannins and...
Yeah, we gathered a few different people because we wanted, just some different palates. And each of us kept our like scores separate. We rated it on a few different like components. First was just like what was agreeable to our modern palate, which is probably not the same as it was 250 years ago. But then, whether it's, we tried some that were made like fresh and then so it wasn't very chilled. We tried some that were a little bit chilled. At that time it wasn't really possible to get things ice cold like we like it to. So we tried a couple different temperatures. Ultimately just to see what felt reasonable and what didn't. Some of them were just gross. Like I think there were a total of 30 points possible. And like, for example, the rum and wine with the green tea lemon.
Oh.
Yeah. Doesn't sound good because it's not good.
No.
But we did it for the sake of science. We sacrificed.
For the sake of science. I love it. So based on your scoring and your ranking, what was the winner, at least with the taste test evaluation?
Yeah, so it's kind of a surprising move. I expected the like straight spirits, the unmixed ones, to be most palatable, most engaging. But in fact, all 3 of our top scorers were blends. So brandy and sherry was in 2 of our top 3, and the third was rum and brandy. So we presented this actually at our mother lodge first before we presented it to the Lodge of Research. And we made up a gallon or 2 gallons of each of these recipes. And then we cast a vote for the lodge for which one we wanted to claim as our sort of like historic recreation.
Okay. And do you know like definitively what the actual recipe was? Or I know we're kind of reverse engineering going off of what the ingredients were based on what they were buying at that time, but did you ever find out conclusively like what the lodge was known for? Was it ever recorded?
Didn't find it in any minutes, probably because that wouldn't be something that we'd write down in minutes.
Of all things we don't write down.
Yeah.
So hidden mysteries of Freemasonry.
Yeah. I wish that we did have an official version, but I think, we can tell from the receipts that depending on who the receipt was paid to, it was just kind of dealer's choice, whatever they had on hand or could readily get.
Thinking it was also kind of seasonable too, because when you said rum, I'm like, oh, that totally makes sense. If New Haven was between Boston and New York City, and we had all the trading that was going down in the Caribbean, and they're bringing in this like amazing rum that would have just been sugar cane, like just amazing taste. And then if you've got brandy, which is, like basically wine that's been put in the oak barrel, so it's going to have a little bit maybe ish of that whiskey. And so if you get like a good sugary rum from, the Caribbean in there mixed with the brandy that's been like oak barrel, you could really, just the textures and where this is going in my head, I'm like, this could actually be pretty tasty. The part where you lose me though is you're like, oh, and then we mix it with tea, and I'm like, that has to be such a different, because tea has a front and back palate hit as well, and I'm guessing it was like English breakfast tea,
just like a standard black tea.
Yeah,
nothing super fancy.
It's almost like if you spiked an Arizona iced tea, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, which I imagine it's been done, and I imagine it's not too bad.
Well, the other thing... Sorry, go ahead.
I preferred the recipe that had tea, personally. I think it kind of rounded out the flavor profile. It is an extra step to do, so I don't hate that that's not what the Lodge picked, but I don't mind it. I actually thought it was pretty tasty.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of the time, we're talking about, after the Revolutionary War, so fans would have been the church style fan that ladies would have carried around to fan themselves with. Like opening a window on a nice day would have been your only source of ventilation. So if you're sitting there now in the summer of 1776 or 80 or whenever, just armpits drenched, it's hot, it's humid, you're in this tight room, you can literally smell everybody else, just how miserable it was. Like something that had a lot of flavor profiles and really could get the job done. That's what you're pouring into your glass. You're not really picky at like what's in it,
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, especially with the fact that, toothbrushes and things like that, not invented yet or widely used during those times. So what I loved about this story was, we had some fun with it. I mean, how can you not? It's a punch bowl that there's a huge history behind it. There's these recipes, which, anytime you get to go into the archives of your lodge and see what your brothers are doing back at those times, like, that's awesome. But the fact that you turned this into a research project, I think is, a way to kind of get the brothers engaged. Like this is one of those things where it's like, hey, we're going to bring 2 gallons of our lodge punch and we need you to be able to try it out at our next meeting. I'm hoping that you had more than 20 guys in attendance for that night.
It was a big crew. Yeah.
Cool. And a great story that, your lodge can share. And as we're sitting here during the America 250 time, I'm sure there's a lot of brothers that are looking for a way to kind of connect with those brothers throughout the years. When it comes to your favorite takeaway of this project, I'm sure there were so many moments from just the different concoctions and combinations that you were putting together in your laboratory, to just, phone calls or visits at the Historical Society to get a little insight, or just maybe chatting with brothers. But what was your favorite part of this history project for your lodge and of the punch?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. One of my fondest memories of this was actually as a byproduct of the research presentation. We were like having a room for after dinner at the Grand Lodge session, right? They do the big fancy dinner, and then there's some hospitality rooms, and we wanted to present this punch to folks that came through our room. And so for whatever reason, the lodge kitchen was not available that day. So I had like 8 guys in my apartment in New Haven. It was very communal, like not one of us, probably 3 or 4 of us were peeling lemons. Somebody was juicing all the lemons. Somebody was uncorking all of these bottles of brandy and sherry to mix together. And, we made like 5 gallons. And even though one or 2 of the brothers present, don't drink, but they were still really excited to come be a part of this. And, they got to mix the shrub, which is all the non-alcoholic stuff, the really good tasting stuff with sparkling water or something else that wet their whistles. It's just really, really fun to see this sort of communal brotherhood. And it's sort of what I imagine it felt like for the brothers making a punch similar to what we have made, 250 years ago.
Yeah, no, that is, I mean, there's the work you're saying that goes into making it that brings everybody together. And then, of course, getting to enjoy it, but it's the work of putting it together. I'm also wondering, liquor store, but I know in our area, they call them package stores. The clerk that saw this group of young guys coming in and buying sherry and brandy, and like, why are these guys buying what was probably like 10, 15 bottles of each at a time? Like,
and not the top shelf stuff, because that's not what was available then. It was like the cheapest brandy, the cheapest sherry we could get.
Nothing but the plastic bottles, just the best for the brothers. That's awesome. Well, unfortunately, this is a podcast episode, so I know you would virtually send me over a sample to try, and I would taste it and tell you that this is fantastic. But I love the story as well as the drunk history behind it, and any chance that we get to just talk about what made Masonry special and America special during this time is pretty cool. So, worshipful brother Cedric Jacobson, thank you so much again for coming back and pouring us some virtual drinks on this edition of the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm hoping that we can share the recipe in the show notes.
Well, they'll definitely be there. Thanks again to my guest this week, worshipful brother Cedric Jacobson. I'm Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. One more guest to go as we get ready to close out our America 250 series, and we'll be highlighting the Grand Lodge of New York with our very own deputy historian, Right Worshipful Lee Justo. That's next week. Until then, let peace and harmony prevail.